All right, hello, and welcome to what will be, I think, episode 10 of Reading Tolkien. Once I get episode 8 and 9 out, or whatever it is, I can't remember now, but we do have a couple of interviews that will be up soon. I've mentioned a few times the interview with, Gergely Nagy, who's a Hungarian scholar, and the other one, Vladimir Burliak, who is a Czech? No. Sorry, Vladimir. I probably got that wrong. Croatian, I think he is. Yes, sorry. Croatian scholar. And they were great interviews, and mainly on Tolkien and metafiction and use of metafictional devices and stuff in his fiction. So they will be out hopefully soon. I'm just waiting on sort of finalizing those, and then we will go from there. And I have a few other interviews possibly lined up, so that should be fun. But today I'm here with Sridhar. So how are you, Sridhar? How have you been?
I've been well. How about you?
Yeah, pretty good. Just busy, but getting there. So this will be another one of our sort of chat episodes where we chat about a particular topic or subject. Today we're going to talk about the Children of Húrin book, which is one of my favourite Tolkien stories, and it's very different to Lord of the Rings. And this was the first time you read, or as it were, listened to this, isn't it? I think, Sridhar?
Yes, it is. It was the first time.
Yeah. How did you like Christopher Lee reading the book? I assumed you listened to that one. I think that's the main one that's out.
Yeah. I did listen to that one. It's quite nice. He has a wonderful voice for this kind of stuff. It's very epic.
Yes, it is.
I will say I think I will probably end up ordering the actual book of it. Because I don't know if this is a problem with fiction in general for audiobooks or particularly the Children of Húrin, but it does, especially in the beginning. It's very sort of name and place heavy, and for me it just sort of like flies through my ears without. It's really hard to sort of grasp it, if you're not looking at it on a page.
Yeah, for sure.
So I definitely think it's good to have the text and the audiobook. I don't know about you. What do you think?
I think that's true, especially for this kind of text that, as you say, is name and place heavy. I mean, especially if you haven't read some of the other first stage stuff, and it's all kind of unfamiliar to you. You might want the map and the book and the introduction, which is quite useful because that goes over a lot of the preceding events. If you don't want to read the whole Silmarillion, which I don't think you have to read this book, although obviously some familiarity with it is going to be useful, if nothing else. But I think you can. Well, you can tell me, because when I read this, of course, I already had some sense of the larger story. But I think it probably works on its own. On some levels, at least, yeah.
I would say that it does. I think it definitely is one of those things where it obviously bears sort of like a lot of rereading to sort of get used to it, and and
sure.
Like you say, I think that the more you know of the sort of background, the better it will be. And if anyone's listening who like hasn't read it, it might even be useful to see if you can find like a summary of it, online or something. Because especially if you're going to listen to it, because like I said, it's easy to get sort of lost in the weeds if you're not really familiar with it yet. And I still think, but if you can sort of fumble your way around well enough, I think you get there eventually, and it's fine enough. Especially after the story like really picks up. Like it's really quite name and place heavy for like a couple chapters or so. So it picks up eventually, but it's I think it stands on its own, but it definitely the more you know before, like the more you know going into it, I think the better it will be probably. Is that fair?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense, I think. So I guess just to give a general introduction to it for those who may not know about it. So this is a kind of a first stage book novel. I'll get into exactly what it is, but it's obviously part of the Silmarillion, I guess, set of stories, the first stage kind of cycle. So it's set quite a while before Lord of the Rings, quite a few thousand years, and it looks at, it looks at a particular family, I guess, set of characters who belong to the same family, and in short, they are cursed, and this book tells the story of their lives as they go through from childhood to the end, and it's pretty bleak, and there's dwarves and elves and various other Tolkienian sort of tropes, if you want to call them that, and no hobbits, which is nice, and it's just as we'll get into, I think it's just quite a different kind of story to Lord of the Rings. It gives a kind of a different side to Tolkien. I don't know. That was probably a pretty shitty synopsis, but do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I had a question. So this is like, what exactly is the nature of this? It's unfinished, but Christopher Tolkien sort of collected some notes and added some stuff. Like, right. I don't exactly understand how this was put together in the form that we sort of have it in.
So it's all written by Tolkien, but it essentially just needed to be edited together, which it was eventually, and then released in its own volume in 2007. Some of it was released 2007? Yeah, it was. Some of it was released earlier in Unfinished Tales, but that was a very different kind of editing job, I guess. And it seems to be that at the time, Christopher, Tolkien's son, thought that it couldn't sort of stand alone in a sort of a complete way, but then he seems to have changed his mind. And as he says, I think in the introduction, or somewhere anyway, he sort of reconsidered the textual. Well, I don't want to call them notes because the drafts, I guess, of the story, and then thought that he could actually, get something more coherent out of it, and so that's what he did. There's nothing written by Christopher there, as far as I know.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's an editing job, and I think as a continuous narrative, I think it works fairly well, and it's pretty close, I think, to what Tolkien would have completed had he lived to do so himself. So I think in that sense, it's fairly valuable, and sort of stands with The Hobbit as a sort of a shorter novel, shorter in a way that you can go into that world without having to read The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, especially if you want to do that. I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but again, I guess it's that issue of, as you say, is it really accessible to someone who doesn't have that prior knowledge, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a peculiar issue, right? It's quite standalone, given that you know certain things.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know that. It would be nice too, because I'm not like a Silmarillion expert.
Yeah. Which is fine, by the way.
But I'm familiar enough with it that I could sort of hang, because I had read it a fair while ago. But it would be interesting to give a copy of the Children of Húrin to someone who's pretty much only sort of versed in like the main sort of Lord of the Rings part of it, and that would be a fun experiment to see how that holds up.
Yeah, no, I agree. That would be interesting. For sure. And I think that's some of the appeal of the book. And, I don't know exactly how widely read it is, but my impression anyway is that from reading reviews on Amazon and things is that quite a few people picked this up who would not otherwise have picked up the Silmarillion or something and sort of enjoyed it, even though they hadn't. and as I said, I think you've listened to the audiobook, right? So the paper copy comes with quite a good introduction. So I think you can sort of orient yourself fairly well, just in this volume, without having to sort of read the story, because the backstory ultimately doesn't matter too much, I think, for this book. I think the story stands on its own to a degree. I think that's true of very few of the other Silmarillion stories, which are much more sort of heavily implicated in the wider narrative of that book. We'll come to why I think that is, but yeah. So I think this, of all the books that Tolkien almost finished, I think this is the one that's that it's most interesting to have actually published in a sort of finished form. Or in a form that's finished enough that that it can be sort of accessible.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. That's fair.
Yeah. So, having given that terrible little synopsis, I'm interested to know what you sort of thought about the book, and yeah, I guess we can go from there. So, what did you think about it?
Like I said, I thought it was interesting. The two things that were sort of most sticking out to me, actually maybe three things. Like the three things that were most sticking out to me is that this feels very secular. Like there's really no sort of divine intervention.
No, yeah.
And then the other two things is that at least as it got to the ending, it really had flavors of Oedipus as well as Pyramus and Thisbe / Romeo and Juliet. There was a sort of literary flair to the latter half of it that I thought was quite interesting. I don't know if you have anything to riff off of any of those points.
Yeah, only that I suppose I would agree with that. And I think for reasons that I'll perhaps get into, or I can get into now. I think the story seems to have been, I don't know, it was sort of at first based on, I think in its earliest manifestations, kind of based on the kind of literature of Finland, at least in the whole, spoilers by the way, the whole brother sleeping with sister aspect of it. It was sort of based on a Finnish myth cycle from the Kalevala. So
interesting. I don't know about any of that. Is there anything to elaborate there?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tolkien basically says as much, and it's fairly well documented because the first sort of written story of his, even before he did any of the early Book of Lost Tales stuff, was a rendition of this particular Kalevala story into prose. So it was kind of a short story, and it's this this sort of blundering hero who eventually seems to be cursed or to somehow fate, as it were, is not on his side, and this hero or character, I don't know if you'd call him a hero, Kulavo, eventually sleeps with his sister, and there's the incest thing, and then there's the suicide thing again with the talking sword at the end. So that seems to be the backbone, and then Turin as a kind of heroic character, or partially heroic character, seems to be heavily sort of inspired by perhaps Norse examples, especially in his kind of attitudes towards life. His sort of I don't know what you call it. You might call it his northern philosophy. Sort of let's fight our battles now, and even if we lose, well, we've still done the best that we can, and we're not really the worse for it because we've we've fought honorably, etc. So I think there's those kind of influences on this story are particularly evident, more so than, and more directly perhaps than they are in some of the other Silmarillion stories, and also the Lord of the Rings, which obviously there are all sorts of influences which perhaps go into that. But yeah, so I think that influence, or that bedrock, gives it a particular kind of flavour right off the bat, right from the start, which is quite distinct from some of his other stories.
Yeah, I need to brush up on my Norse mythology, I guess, or whatever, my Norse literature. So when you are talking about Turin's northern attitude, could you say more about what you mean by that, and like as opposed to what? Like, what is that contrasted with?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something I still don't know exactly myself, but I think Tolkien is, of course, famous for his Catholicism, his sort of imbuing the Lord of the Rings with that kind of moral universe, with that kind of moral sentiment, I guess, which I think is true to an extent, at least. There's obviously something loosely Catholic, if you like, about at least some aspects of the Lord of the Rings, especially in its sort of evocation of providence, perhaps. That's perhaps the most obvious place where that manifests. But I think, as you mentioned here before, I think at least some of the characters in this book, Turin and some of the others, actually, some of the other human characters, the mortal characters especially, tend to exhibit this attitude towards life, which is quite distinct from, say, Aragorn or some of the characters in Lord of the Rings. And, as I said, I think it's this theory of what Tolkien might have called theory of northern courage, which is, well, even though we know that the curse or fate or whatever it might be, even though that's going to get you eventually, you sort of fight anyway, because there's something honorable or perhaps just necessary. Perhaps it's just, it's a sort of it's sort of the only choice that you have as a kind of mortal. It's to fight those battles as best you can, even though that in the end you'll be defeated and you'll die, and it'll all be a disaster and a tragedy. So
yeah, so it's almost like a deontological view. Is that fair? Am I missing that?
Ontological. Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, deontological, that would refer to Kant's theory, right, of moral action, and
yeah,
I
think so. I mean, I'm sure any real philosophers are listening to this pulling their hair out, but
that's all right. Yeah. No, I think it's sort of. I mean, it doesn't necessarily. The thing about this particular northern worldview, if you like, to take it from that, which really does come from the sort of Norse literary canon, or perhaps more specifically some of the sagas, which again I'm not an expert in either, so I'm not going to try. But Tom Shippey recently wrote a book about, well, essentially it was a book about Norse literature, really. Even it was sort of billed as a book about the Vikings, but it's really a book about Norse literature, and he talks about the northern theory of courage, if you like, and it's not really an ethical position in a sense, or it doesn't have to be. It's more a position that you might say is in some sense nihilistic. It doesn't necessarily have to have an ethic, and so the dark side of that worldview is that if you believe that your duty is to sort of fight the battles that face you in this world, without regard for sort of other people necessarily, or other future generations, or ethical concerns that we might have. Obviously the dark side of that worldview is that you might end up committing atrocities, even if you are not intending to do so. So, which I think is a theme in sort of not the Norse.
Yeah,
view. Yeah,
I see more what you mean now. I mean, Turin definitely has this the sense when sort of in the fight against Morgoth, that does seem more of a. It seems more like a almost like an ethical position. Like I could sort of see some sort of deontology being applied there. Like this is the good thing to do, regardless of what the consequence is going to be.
Yeah, I see what you mean by that.
But in a lot of his life, sort of leading up to that, it seems to make him, quite a bit of a nuisance as well. In a way that I don't think you could apply the same kind of ethical position when you're talking about a fight in sort of good and evil, where that attitude gets him to do something that I think is sort of morally courageous in the face of sort of overwhelmingly negative odds, like universally negative odds. But because it's not really like a nuanced ethics that he's applying, it's more just a sort of is bluster a fair word? So
I think there's definitely an element of bluster too.
Yeah. So like earlier, like he is sort of portrayed, at least I kind of read it as sort of he was kind of portrayed as almost a nuisance to some people. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, it depends exactly on which episode you're talking about of the book. But
I was thinking of the Outlaws.
Oh yeah, well yeah, that's a funny. Yeah, so he obviously hooks up, as it were, with a group of outlaws for a while. Once he's, as it were, banished from Doriath, the sort of elf kingdom where he grows up as a child and then young adult, and then he seems to sort of lose any sense of ethical principle during this period, and sort of pillages and whatnot, and lives the life of that sort of of an outlaw. And yeah, it's implied that he does become, at the very least, a kind of a nuisance, I guess, to some of the local people. Probably worse than that, actually, but
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely, he's not sort of a, he's not a paragon of virtue like Aragorn is. I mean, one can't imagine Aragorn joining a band of outlaws.
No, even when he is sort of in exile, he's a noble exile.
Yeah, he's a noble exile. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. No, he always works towards particular sort of goals that he sees as highly righteous, I guess. And one can not really imagine Turin doing that sort of a thing, at least not in a grand sense, because ultimately his motivation is really just to protect his family. It's not really, doesn't really extend to sort of Middle Earth as a whole or anything like that. I think anyway, that's my reading of him.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Yeah.
To sort of go with the contrast with Turin and Aragorn, can you sort of like point to one or two places in this story where Turin does something that you think sort of where you think Aragorn? I mean, obvious things like the outlaws aside,
Yep.
I don't think Aragorn would ever like pillage, but like say in the decision to fight against Morgoth, like what do you think Aragorn would do there, and why? And like, are there any other places where the contrast seems quite stark to you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I guess I think it's particularly in his decision to do battle against Morgoth when in Nargothrond, the sort of elvish kingdom that he ends up inadvertently destroying. When he makes that decision, I think that Aragorn would have listened to advice, and he would have waited. He would have bided his time. I think also Aragorn would have been completely. I think he would have been completely sort of not dependent, but he would have listened to Melian, the sort of wise character, more or less taken her advice, and I think Aragorn does, he does grow up in Rivendell, right? So he also grows up in like an elvish refuge, but of course we see that he, his life story is more or less, as I said, the opposite of Turin's. So he doesn't act rashly. He bides his time. He, et cetera, where I think that Turin obviously, famously, I suppose, for people who read the Silmarillion, fails several key moments to heed the advice of those around him. And but I think again, Aragorn is just a heroic character in a very different sense. Some would say maybe a Christian. He's a Christian hero in a way, but I think that overstates the matter. I think he's just I think Aragorn is a kind of. I think I wrote somewhere in our notes, he's a kind of stoic hero, and I mean that because I think he really exhibits the kind of stoic virtues to an extent that someone like Turin doesn't. So, Aragorn exhibits, patience, wisdom, sort of temperance, those sorts of virtues, where Turin, if we're thinking about this contrast with this sort of northern theory, if you like, this Norse idea, and if Turin sort of embodies that to an extent, well, he is impetuous. He just, he faces the world as it is. He's not distracted, if you like, by sort of an abstract, calculation of sort of virtue per se. Whereas I think one can say that about Aragorn. It's not that Aragorn completely, just reading Lord of the Rings recently, rereading it, I was struck by how Aragorn also exhibits some characteristics of the northern heroic temperament. Like he speaks a couple of times about vengeance. He does doubt himself a little bit, but at other times he really is that sort of stoic sage hero almost. He, as I say, he exhibits those virtues. So I think that's an interesting way to, or an interesting way to contrast those two characters.
Yeah, is it fair to say that that part of Aragorn's journey is to sort of learn when to be stoic and when to be more northern or whatever? Is that
maybe?
Like, does he sort of switch back and forth with any sort of more nuance as the books progress?
Not really, because famously, I mean, Aragorn's character is drawn fairly distantly, and this is a criticism some people have of the book, right? Is that Aragorn just seems like such this sort of figure on a pedestal or whatever, statuesque almost. Some people have even said, well, he doesn't have a character. I think that's wrong, but I mean, I think that again, I don't think Aragorn is sort of the focus of the book. Really, the hobbits are, but I think that in terms of his moral character, I don't think there's all that much growth, as you might put it, in a novelistic sense, because we really meet Aragorn when he's already done all that, when he's already gone through all that. Right. Perhaps that makes him a boring character for some people, but I think it's still an interesting. He's still an interesting kind of figure in the way that he sort of embodies some of those, as I said, sort of moral sentiments that we're clearly meant to, for the most part, sort of follow along with, I guess. Where a character like Turin, I think, is, well, I don't know. Obviously, we're not meant to, I think, just follow along with him. We're meant to some extent to sort of pity his his life and his choices, but but I think at the same time he's sort of portrayed in a more ambiguous way. At least that's my reading.
Yeah, for sure. And he really sort of this is Turin that I'm talking about.
Yes, yeah,
he really I think he sort of embodies the concept of moral luck. I think in a way that not a lot of characters in the Lord of the Rings do. I think it's a more
great point.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd love to hear sort of more what causes you to think that. But yeah, for me, it's having a depiction of his childhood is really important for that, because I don't know if this is exactly what you mean by it, but there's this great sense in the Children of Húrin that everything like sort of is to some extent very contingent, highly contingent, sort of not only the events that occur to you, but also your own personality. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you got that sense or if that's what you mean, but that's what I would have said. Because we meet him early on. He's in his childhood. He has this sister who sort of just dies, very young. There's this sense that this is meaningless. That the characters in the book can't really make sense of it. And indeed, there's a conversation, right, where Turin says, actually, I'll read it out. It's somewhere here. There's a sense really that if I can find it, that life is somehow highly precarious, and I certainly don't get that sense from Lord of the Rings necessarily. So on my copy, it's page 43. But so Turin asked this sort of friend that he has. He's like a, I don't know, servant or something. But so this is just after his sister has died, and he says, "What is fate? As to the fate of men," said Sridhar, who's this character, "you must ask those who are wiser than Labadel," which is his nickname. But as all can see, we weary soon and die. And by mischance, many meet death even sooner. But the elves do not weary, and they do not die save by great hurt. From wounds and grief that would slay men, they may be healed, and even when their bodies are marred, they return again, some say. It is not so with us. Then Lilith will not come back, said Turin. Where has she gone? She will not come back, said Sridhar. But where she has gone no man knows, or I do not. So I think that conversation there just sort of encapsulates the whole theme of this story, which is that it's kind of shitty to be human and we sort of die way too soon.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got that sense of it, but for me, that captures the whole the whole sort of thing, really.
Yeah, I think that's it's definitely quite a bit more sort of pessimistic in its scope, or maybe nihilistic is a better way.
Maybe even that. I think that conversation really captures that sense of moral luck that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the characters in this book, they really don't have any sense of the providential at all. It's just not there. It's just not. I mean, maybe the elves do. I mean, to some extent, but certainly, if we're just thinking about this book, I would have thought that it really is a kind of, or that it sort of takes place almost in a different universe to the Lord of the Rings, in some ways.
Yeah, it seems to be a world that is. I don't know if this is true, but it seems to be a world that is sort of much more aware of its decay.
Yeah.
Than the Lord of the Rings. So, like, the characters at least seem to be. I
think the people in Lord of the Rings are aware of decay as well, and I mean, we have that through through Lothlorien, through sort of some of that sense that, perhaps ironically, in the Lord of the Rings, it's the elves who are sort of trying to preserve everything against the ruins of time, as it were. But there's certainly not that sense of like immediate mortal danger as there is here, I think. it really evokes a sort of a world, a sense of a world in war, in the throes of war, and that is on the brink of sort of catastrophe, and that death could kind of come at any moment. And I think in that sense also it's kind of similar to the saga literature of Iceland, in the sense that it evokes this world of sort of immediate physical danger as well as sort of existential threat, which you get in the Lord of the Rings more, sort of that sense of this threat that's to some extent off in the distance.
Yeah. It seems in the Lord of the Rings, it's everything is sort of further away. Like the problems are sort of not sort of as concentrated or as nearby as it seems in the Children of Húrin. But I was also thinking of like the way that it sort of turns into him like it's painted as a bad decision that he makes to go into battle with Morgoth. Is that fair?
Well, particularly in some parts, like in Nargothrond, for example. Yeah, I think when he's takes the elves out and gets them all destroyed.
Yeah.
And then the dragon goes in the takes over the kingdom and sits on the gold.
Yeah. But what exactly was he supposed to do? Am I missing something?
No, that's right. Well, I mean, I guess again, it comes back to this conflict between the humans who have obviously the short lives and the elves who can sort of sit around, and so I think there's a sort of thematic contrast that's set up there, and in the book anyway, it's sort of implied that Turin should have obviously stayed in Nargothrond. He shouldn't have built the bridge. He should have avoided battle, at least for some period. But yeah, I think the question that Turin would ask is, what am I supposed to do? Which is what he does say. Are we really? And I think this is where you can see perhaps that Tolkien is. Well, I don't know. You can see perhaps that there is a cost to this northern epic or northern sentiment, northern heroic sentiment, which says that you go out and face the demons, as it were, and just battle them, and come what may. Which is that he gets the kingdom destroyed, but of course the problem or the issue is that if the wider Silmarillion. That's going to happen at some point anyway. So it's like there's really a question about, what really should he have done in that situation? And unfortunately, the Nargothrond chapters are the least developed. So I think Tolkien would have written those chapters up quite a lot more had he finished the book properly. But so unfortunately, that those chapters kind of give too brief of a picture of what's going on there. But I think in general the distinction in the book is or one contrast in the book is between sort of the fact that the elves have these long lives means that they can sort of sit around and wait for things to improve, or that they can wait for an opportune moment, whereas humans can't do that. And I think that's why this idea that Turin sort of embodies the northern theory of courage, if you like, is important, because the book is sort of asking, is this a viable way to face life, with this kind of I don't know, philosophical or I don't want to say ideological, but point of view, the point of view that says, well, we don't have much time. We've got to fight the battles we have to fight, and it's better for the battles are better for having been fought. Or do we sit around and wait? But if we do that, we might just die before we've achieved anything. So which is, I think ultimately the book, if you were to ask him, I think Tolkien would probably say, well, this northern idea is kind of it's kind of tragic and pessimistic, as you said, and therefore ultimately mistaken, because we have the Catholic faith, and we have redemption in whatever in Christ and whatever, and that's what provides an answer to this existential problem of human life. But of course, if you don't believe that, then I think this book can sort of function or serve as a contrast to Lord of the Rings, and that sort of perhaps a more orthodox vision in some respects, anyway.
Yeah. I definitely got that feeling that this jived a lot more with my general attitude towards the world.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know about you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's why I like it, because it does. I mean, I like Lord of the Rings too, and I don't think the Lord of the Rings can be just reduced to its Catholic propaganda. I don't think that's what it is. But certainly there is a sense of the providential there that is lacking here, I think, and which the shift in emphasis to a character who exhibits these kinds of these sentiments, which, again, as I said, sort of really comes out of Norse saga literature. I think that just gives such a contrast to the hobbits and and Aragorn and those characters in Lord of the Rings, and I think that's why I like it. And as you said, I think it jives better with my own worldview anyway, which is a slightly pessimistic one.
Yeah, it really is. It really is a sharp contrast in just how bleak it is. I mean, for both Turin and Húrin and like their whole family, like they sort of annihilation, but not only the annihilation, but the sort of like the degradation is total. It's total and complete, and there isn't not only is there like no providence to be had, it's just like, that doesn't even exist. It seems it's not even on the table.
Well, what I find funny is that in that conversation, for example, which I mentioned before, which I quoted before, there's no sense of the divine at all. There's no like, well, we go to some place where we meet our maker, as it were. The characters themselves don't seem to have any awareness of that. Which I find fascinating.
And they say it too, which is
yeah.
It's one thing to not know, but say like this is just what we believe, and we act as if it's true. He actually says, we don't know. The implication being probably it's nothing. That's how I read it, at least.
Yeah, and of course, again, Tolkien, the Catholic, would probably want to come back and say, well, the characters are just sort of ignorant. They haven't sort of had the revelation, as it were. But I think it's just truer to life that if that's a criterion that we want to use, that people would in a situation like this, in a sort of pre-Christian world, if you like, or a post-Christian world, perhaps. Simply admit ignorance about sort of life after death or whatever, because that's actually a reasonable position to have. And in a pagan context, which this one kind of is, I think that's a reasonable thing for the characters to say, and not at all sort of out of place.
Yeah.
So it's an odd one, and I think for some people, I think there's an urge to want to to draw it in and assimilate it to the sort of overall Christian or perhaps loosely theistic vision of the Lord of the Rings, and to some extent the rest of the rest of the narrative. But I think the story resists that, at least for me, anyway.
Do you have any ideas about why it might be so different? It does seem sort of anomalous, and I wonder how he came
as
to
I
write
said
it.
before, because it's so heavily inspired by essentially non-Christian literatures, or at least literatures that speak to a non-Christian world, so other sort of Icelandic culture, or perhaps Finnish folk culture. I think that's why ultimately, but you might say, well, why didn't Tolkien more thoroughly revise it so that, I don't know, we have some sense of the catastrophe at the end, that is the good catastrophe. Why is the tragedy so complete? I don't know, and I don't know the answer to that question, but I think Tolkien was more complex than only sort of a Christian propagandist, as some people want him to be. And I don't think this story is easy to assimilate into that whole picture, unless you just want to make a blanket sort of theological statement like, well, all suffering is noble in the end because it's has some purpose that's inaccessible to us. I think in philosophy this is called skeptical theism, like this idea that, well, the amount and gratuity of suffering can never speak against God, because God can always have reasons for permitting suffering that we don't know about. So, I think you can make that sort of a blanket theological statement about it, and I guess that assimilates the story into the wider framework, but it does so somewhat inelegantly.
Yeah. I think what you say is right, that it really throws a wrench into a sort of straight up Catholic reading.
Mm-hmm.
It really does sort of complicate the picture from someone who didn't really know about the story or sort of how it shakes out. It surprises me, and I think it. If I had known about it before, I don't think I would be so conflicted in being conflicted about his Catholicism.
Yeah.
But do you hear that? It sounds like someone's having a party outside.
Yeah. Good on them, I guess.
I guess, or maybe it's a protest. It almost sounds like people are chanting.
Wow, what's going on here?
I don't know. Who knows? In any case, what were we talking about? How he came to write something that's so dark. Oh yeah, is there any sort of relation between this and maybe sort of like the book of Job, in which it also seems like God is sort of fairly capriciously like malicious towards Job, for seemingly no reason at all.
The funny thing
I'm not an expert, but
it's really Morgoth, aka the devil, who's like acting like God in that story.
Right? Yeah.
I think. Well, I mean, I don't know the extent to which it was an inspiration, but I think there are some obvious thematic parallels, and also like Manfred, the Byronic sort of hero from the poem. I don't know if you've read that, but there are sort of several literary resemblances, which some of which you mentioned before. The most obvious, which are sort of perhaps the Oedipus and the Greek tragic cycle. That whole cycle, but also, as I said, some of this Finnish or also Norse, which I think particularly comes through in Turin's character.
Well, I mean, maybe this is wrong, but or maybe this is a far more common trope than I give it credit for. But doesn't Paramus fall on his own sword in Paramus and Thisbe as well, where they are sort of
it's been so long since I've read that. That's
from Ovid. Yeah.
It's been so long since I've read it, but yeah, possibly. Yeah,
it's another sort of case of. I mean, it's slightly more. It's slightly different here because they're brother and sister.
Yes. Yeah.
But it seems another case of sort of misaligned lovers.
It's a. I think it's it's a story that has resonances in several classical and also northern mythical stories. As I said, and also to an extent the romantics as well. Turin is a sort of a Byronic figure, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. It's in some ways it seems a lot more modern than the rest of his stuff.
Yeah,
but
I think only because I think that is perhaps partly because, as I said, it has its attitudes towards death and sort of mortality are modern, and at least for some of us, I guess, in the sense that there is a kind of overwhelming pessimism. There is an overwhelming sense of the tragic, which is not obviously that is not exclusive to modernity, but it's often it is often remarked on by mostly by religious people apparently who don't like this particular development in our cultures. But the modern is the modern is anchorless. That we have no way to approach death. That we're sort of that all we do is consume and sort of try and avoid the reality of mortality, which is funny to say after COVID. And I mean, there is truth in that. I think in that 500,000 deaths in the US, and someone was saying the other day, that no one's ever published pictures of people dying and in the hospitals from COVID. There's an extent to which our culture sort of ignores death as well. So.
Yeah, that's the great irony of the improvement of our health in general, right? Is that one can go, one can have a fairly good run without having any sort of real confrontation with death in their lives. Until it's the big one.
So. I think a book like this, on some level, at least feels more modern for that reason. That it sort of, as we've talked about, its characters are not unlike Aragorn, who at the end of his life sort of willingly gives up his life and says, he says to Arwen, beyond the circles of the world, there's more than memory. Sort of expresses this vaguely religious idea. No one, I can't imagine any of the humans in this book saying anything like that and being taken seriously.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you talking about? This is all we've got. This is what we have to face. It's before us here, and I think, at least to some extent, that's a modern sort of idea, I guess, or a modern sensibility.
Yeah, it certainly feels like it. Did you want to speak a bit to? I'm looking at our notes here, at your notes, really. And you have a bit here about the ambiguity of the story towards his characters.
Sure.
And you say something about contrasting it with Gandalf, and I don't exactly know what you mean, so I'm curious what you mean by that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I guess this again relates to sort of stances towards ethics. So we've talked about Aragorn, who has this. I've called Aragorn a stoic hero. I think that's a better way to think about Aragorn than really a Catholic. I mean, he's not, or something like that, or specifically Christian. I think he's more of a stoic in the sense that he's bound by a set of virtues. So he's kind of virtue ethical, if you like, and that's really the way that he operates. Where, as I've said, Turin kind of embodies this kind of northern theory of courage, as it might be called. But
just real quick, I think I would agree with you that I think Aragorn is probably better cast as a Stoic, because even with sort of Catholic morality, there's some level at which it feels to me almost like self-aggrandizing. Like even if one is trying to do the right thing, it's because one is actually trying to do the right thing oneself. Whereas the way that Aragorn sort of treats his decisions and his ethics, it seems he almost removes himself from the situation and tries to really see what is the best thing to do, regardless of what exactly it is that is that is what he has to do. I don't know if that true.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. No, I think that's right. But I think also the book itself, or the text itself, if you want to talk like that, has an ambiguous stance towards the characters. So a lot of people take Turin to be sort of a bumbling idiot. I don't think that's true. I think he has, if you read the book carefully, he's characterized as someone who has a kind of, who is in some ways kind of quite sentimental and, and perhaps feels pain very acutely, more acutely perhaps than other characters do. And so, as I mentioned before, his motivation is always his family to some extent, right? He wants to save them from Morgoth and from sort of a bad fate more generally. So, which is what perhaps spurs him to make many of the silly decisions that he does. Sometimes the book or a character will accuse Turin of pridefulness, and certainly that is an element of his character, I think. But I think perhaps there's also a sense there that his pridefulness is simply a sort of an outcome of his mortality, his character, as a mortal, someone who, pridefulness is a kind of response, another kind of response to being mortal, right? Because you have to sort of achieve things in life. So I think that there is a kind of ambiguous stance towards the character. The book doesn't just sort of condemn Turin, I think, and that really shows itself at the end. I think when there's suicide, right? And Tolkien was a Catholic. He kind of approved of suicide. And I'm not saying he would have approved of it, but there's really no, at least my reading is that there's no judgment in the text, especially there's no moral judgment in the text.
Right.
If there's judgment of Turin, it's really just his judgment of his certain elements of his character, but not for moral reasons, just for sort of prudential reasons almost. So when I'm talking about Gandalf, so when Boromir, of course, commits suicide in Lord of the Rings, and Gandalf sort of has this sermon-like speech, which is that you don't have the right to take your own life, blah blah blah. That's very sort of, again, I can't imagine Gandalf in this world. It would seem somehow out of place. He would seem ridiculous. I don't think the characters would really listen to him. They'd just say, "Go stuff yourself." It's quite distinct, I think, and in Lord of the Rings, the sense is very much that did I say Boromir? I meant Denethor.
Yeah.
Denethor, Boromir's father, commits suicide. Yeah. Boromir doesn't commit suicide.
I figured that's what you meant.
Yeah, not quite in that sense.
Yeah, in the sort of grand,
in the grand sort of sense he does by protecting them. But anyway, the point is that there's this clear sort of judgment placed on Denethor for committing suicide. It's like, well, and it's given by Gandalf, who is kind of the most, if you want a character sort of who espouses Christian moral ideas, or just at all in the book, it's really Gandalf, because Gandalf's really the one who says that, who seems to have some belief in providence, that you were meant to find the ring, and that's an encouraging thought. And then Frodo says, in the book at least, he says, "Oh, it's not, it's not encouraging." But anyway, so I don't know if Frodo really gives it a second thought, but Gandalf's that sort of character who espouses or who sermonizes really about sort of moral issues to an extent, and more even than Aragorn. Aragorn doesn't really do that either. As I said, he sort of just lives out his values, but he doesn't really sermonize about them all that much. But Gandalf does a bit, especially as Gandalf the White, the sort of even more, sort of ennobled figure that he becomes. But in the book, in this book, Children of Húrin, there's no sense that the text is asking us to condemn like that, or at least that's my reading. Did you think any different?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I got the same feeling, and it sort of made it feel more like a true tragedy. At the end, there was no in various parts. It seemed like there was more or less sort of like meta commentary of the philosophy around it, but By the end, it seems just like a straight up like tragic novel, or anything like that. It just seems. I mean, obviously, there's a long scope because the tragedy is sort of born of a curse. But yeah, it doesn't seem like there's that much of moralizing from the text. It's pretty straightforward. It gets more straightforward as it goes on.
Yeah. There are certainly some parts where it feels like there's some meta commentary, like Turin's pridefulness, or there's a sense that, but I think the character is drawn sort of more subtly than that for the most part. And again, maybe this is because this text is. I think it's an interesting text because it shows that Tolkien is both a pessimist but also an optimist. If we're thinking about it in the philosophical sense, right? I mean, he's a pessimist in some ways, but he wants to be an optimist, I think. But sometimes perhaps he can't make himself feel that way. And look, that's too much. That's too much sort of biographizing. but that's the impression I get. Where in the Lord of the Rings, I get that too, perhaps in a different sense. I mean, ultimately, the Lord of the Rings is also about sort of entropy and decay as well. But obviously, as we've mentioned, like not in that perhaps very visceral sense. But there's definitely something going on there between those two sides of his character, perhaps, or and I know that some Tolkien scholars have remarked that he seems to have these two sides to his character. Sometimes he'll sound really optimistic in his letters or something, and other times he'll sound really like a pessimist. And I think that just comes through so clearly here, and presumably is something that drew him to some of those non-Christian or perhaps quasi-Christian sort of Norse or other stories in the first place.
Yeah. You sent me like a little forum, and
yes.
in there it seemed like there were a few people who were saying that that Tolkien couldn't have written the Children of Húrin if he weren't a survivor of the Somme. Is that what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean I think that again that sort of plays into the idea that there are perhaps those sides to his character ultimately. No doubt, fighting in a war probably, expands your pessimistic imagination to some extent.
But, certainly makes you no stranger to the sort of like total nihilist, or like the total nihilism that life can be, I guess. Or
Absolutely.
I can imagine.
I don't think Tolkien is a philosophical nihilist, and I think ultimately. Although, I think this book comes closer than some people want to admit, I think. And indeed, just the Silmarillion in general, I think, the wider, I think, comes a little closer than some people would want to admit. I think there are definite pessimistic strains. And I'm saying not just like the pessimistic affect, like I'm a bit pessimistic today. I mean, in the sense of the philosophy, which is that, that ultimately... what we do in life is in some sense, if not meaningless, but limited in its, in its valence, in its meaningful valence. And, I think that's certainly what a character like Turin, but also like more or less all the other human characters in this story would profess to believe, really, and more or less do. As we've said, there's no invocation of the divine. There's no sense of providence here. Certainly there are sort of larger-than-life characters, obviously the elves, but they function really here as sort of a contrast to the humans, the mortals,
That's a really good point.
So, yeah, definitely I think we can point to several biographical details which might be pertinent, including warfare, obviously.
Yeah. So, just really quickly, I'm sorry if you want to move on to something else, but if you say that this gets closer to nihilism than than people want to admit. The implication there being that you don't actually think that this is ultimately nihilistic. What would you say? What would you say is the sort of general thing of this?
The philosophical position. I don't think ultimately you can call it nihilist, because I think there is enough, or there is a sense in the text that obviously there are still these characters who who profess some kind of I don't know how to put it, like they're obviously connected with the divine in some ways, right? Like the elves or whatever. But having said that, I think, I don't know, if we're taking nihilism as the sort of philosophy that there's no meaning or sort of moral sentiment which is true, or I don't know, does that capture nihilism?
Just kind of nothing matters.
Nothing matters sort of thing. Then I don't know if it's quite like that, because obviously Turin is not ultimately a nihilist. He's motivated by his desire. He's really motivated by his by the suffering of his family and his desire to save them from that fate, and ultimately his sister as well. Ironically,
True.
But
family so in every sense of the term, man.
Yes, in every sense. So he's not a nihilist in the sense that he believes in nothing, but I just don't think he's a virtue ethicist like Aragorn. I don't think he's motivated by a sense of the greater good or anything like that. I don't think that's what really that's not really the sort of hero he is. I think that's perhaps some extent to which that would he would scoff at that idea and say, well, So I don't think it's nihilist for that reason, but it is pessimistic. I think that in a philosophical sense, it's not that nothing matters. It's just that everything everything that we think matters is destroyed, and that's kind of shitty. And there's no real consolation for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess in my sort of elementary reading, I guess I was sort of putting the sort of moral or like the philosophical center of the book sort of outside of Turin, in that, like, of course, Turin himself is not a nihilist, but for all his efforts, he is, like I said before, he's sort of crushed in a sort of really, really like total way. It's almost like absurd. And I kind of read that as sort of like, maybe not nothing matters, but nothing that you could possibly control in your tiny life as a human matters.
I think that is an eminently plausible reading of the book, because like it depends how specific you want to make it. Like if you want to take it as a kind of allegorical story of human life in general, then maybe. I think, as I said, I think there's a lot of people resistant to that reading because, again, they want Tolkien to be a consolation, really. I mean, that's why a lot of people read The Lord of the Rings, right? And that's in part because why I like it as well. There's something consolatory in it to an extent. Even if you're not a believer or something, there's a sense that it, I don't know, in its sort of sad and somewhat beautiful elegiac quality, there's something lovely in it. But for this book, it's not really elegiac. It's just, as you say, sort of the characters are crushed at the end, and that's that. Like there's no within the space of this book, there's no consolation. And you can read consolation into it if you want to read his other books and say, well, ultimately, it's just the darkness before the dawn. It's just it's just the suffering that that we all have to face. But in the end, we have the eucatastrophe, and the eagles come to save everyone.
So I mean, this might be reading too much into it now, like as a sort of philosophical proxy for the real world. But to people who would say that, I almost wonder if they're running up against the same kind of immorality that I see that's sort of inherent in all of the Abrahamic religions, which is that they're so convinced of the sort of ultimate eucatastrophe that sort of awaits the universe in their belief system that and they can witness sort of real horribleness in what we know to be real life, like real horribleness that's happening in front of your face, and say it's going to be okay in the end. It's like, no, that's not what matters. They're children with bone cancer. I don't know what you would have to say to that.
No, I share that sentiment. I mean, I think that's why I love this book so much, because it's sort of my reading is definitely, if not quite nihilistic, then at least it somehow contains within it a sort of a sense of that side of life, if you like.
Yeah.
I think you just put it really well before when you said, what did you say about luck, moral luck, or whatever? I think it sort of captures this sense that it's somehow luck all the way down, right?
Right.
Turin's character is not a matter of luck, but so is the curse in a sense, right? Because really what we're given is the perspective of Turin, and then to some extent Nienor as well, which is in their position, from their point of view, having this curse sort of foisted on them is just kind of bad luck, right? In some sense,
right?
Because they didn't do anything to deserve it, right? It's not a moral condemnation or anything like that. In that sense, it's similar to Job, right? It's like trying to make sense of that sense of. And in Job, the answer is, well, God's just big and powerful. He's a big sky warrior, and you just have to do what he says. In this, it's a little more nuanced. I would think. I think Morgoth here is kind of almost emblematic of. And sometimes characters just talk about fate, right? They don't even talk about the curse. There's a sense that the curse is a sort of. A sort of allegorical way to talk about fate in a more general sense, perhaps. I don't know. But obviously there's a story function that it serves. But in a sense, we're all cursed, right?
Yeah.
We're all cursed by Morgoth.
Yeah.
Perhaps not to that extent, but yeah. So, it depends how expansively you want to read the themes of the book into life in general. And I know for a lot of people who've read this book, they don't want to do that. They want to. The Lord of the Rings is the thing, and this is just kind of like a weird kind of outlier thing that Tolkien wrote, but we won't sort of talk about that. Yeah.
Right.
And as I said, I don't think the Lord of the Rings itself is like consolatory in any sort of I don't know, in a way that is ultimately demeaning to one's intelligence, right? I mean, I think it's ultimately perhaps consoling in a pessimistic way as well, but obviously not quite so brazenly pessimistic or tragic as this has a tendency to be, I think.
Right.
So I know that's how I take it anyway.
Yeah. But there's also something interesting where I think it was Nabokov who said that great art is always exalting. Like you always, regardless of how bad the subject of the art is, if it's done well, like it'll always sort of lift you. And there's some sense in which the author of this tale is really Morgoth, and in that sense, it seems to be a sort of a nice, interesting sort of twist on the kind of Lucifer and Satan that you see in Milton, where he is a sort of literary figure almost. I think I was sort of talking about Milton a little bit last time, but as a sort of, to put it mildly, like an author of mischief, sort of drawing from sort of Chaucer's Pardoner to Iago to Edmund from King Lear, who sort of has the kind of psychopathy that Morgoth has here, the sort of total psychopathy. And then going into sort of Milton's Lucifer as a sort of an evil figure, but one who has his own tragedy sort of behind him, and what he thinks is a sort of reasonable bone to pick with his god, and then goes on to sort of be a sort of a really sort of fecund, a sort of writer of literary tales, as it were. I mean, if it's a kind of psychopathic reading, but there's something interesting there, where it's like, oh man, like he really orchestrated all of this. This is insane.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Morgoth I've never thought about him as a particularly interesting character, but I guess there are facets. He sort of exists in a continuum of those sorts of characters that you mentioned. Yeah. Obviously after Milton, like all these figures have some sort of resonance with this Satan in Paradise Lost. I think Morgoth is far less of a romantic hero.
Sure.
Not that Satan is meant to be, but he's obviously inspired the Romantics to an extent.
Yeah.
He certainly has his own tragedy behind him as well.
It's not much consolation, but
no.
But maybe that adds to the sort of nihilism of it all. It's not like he is his backstory is totally sort of free from any sort of dissonance, and he's just a sort of psychopath for no reason.
No, yeah, he definitely. I mean, obviously that's presented more theologically in the sort of creation myth, but and it's very partisan, of course. He just wanted to riff on his own stuff. But sure, that's it. If you're familiar with that, which is the music creation story. But certainly. I mean, if anyone's a nihilist in this story, it's probably Morgoth, obviously. Which implies that that implies obviously that we shouldn't perhaps take the nihilistic position. And as I said, I think a nihilistic reading is a little, I don't know if I would want to go there, but definitely I think you could read the book that way. Yeah. Legitimately, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you were so inclined.
It's hard to not be nihilistic when you have Christopher Lee reading to you, to be fair.
Well, that's true. Yeah. That's true. I think he brings out that side of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to get back to that point, I mean, I think the book has an ambiguity towards its characters. Sometimes it seems a little more judgy of Turin, but then sometimes it's not, and it sort of it just sort of follows him in a more neutral way. But there's definitely never that sort of moralistic tone that a Gandalf figure will impart to us, for example.
Sure.
And were such a character to pop up in this world, I almost feel like that would feel out of place or, a bit silly.
Yeah. I like what you said. I forget if you said this earlier, if it was in your notes,
right.
that it seems to take place in a different moral universe, and I think that's the best way of putting it.
I mean, I think the problem with Tolkien's not a problem, but an issue with reception of Tolkien's works is that because it's all meant to be set, of course, in this world, right? I mean, the assumption, perhaps it's not a bad assumption, is that the sort of moral universe constructed quite delicately in The Lord of the Rings applies, therefore, also to all the other texts. But I think what's interesting, and this brings us back to the metafictional stuff, which I've been talking about with people in the last couple of interviews, is that if we take these texts to some extent to be sort of the outcomes of literary cultures of these societies themselves, we shouldn't expect that the moral sentiments these stories present us with are all going to be exactly the same. And even just thinking in a real world sense, right? I mean, authors do write different kinds of books. The same author can write books with different kinds of sentiments, and they can emphasize certain things, perhaps from their personality or whatever, from certain sources that they've read. I don't know if one could say of Shakespeare, not to say Tolkien is Shakespeare, but you know what I mean. I don't know if one could say of Shakespeare that he has one singular philosophical sentiment that is expressed equally in all of his plays.
No, yeah.
And the same here, just because these books are set, as it were, in the same world, I don't think that implies that they're all of the same mind, as it were, with regards to their sort of, the way that you can read them and the sort of moral sentiments and that you can, that you can take away from them. Sorry. I'm not getting bored.
You're boring yourself, man.
Yeah, I'm just so bored of it. No, I'm just tired. But
no, I think you're right, and I think that's a real problem. That's a real problem with a lot of Tolkien criticism. It seems that people
I feel like it's like, I call it like franchising, or like the whole world becomes this franchise that's just, it's all the same. It's just like different stories. Like, no, you got to look at the texts themselves. Like, the texts don't approach the characters in the same way, or The Hobbit is a little bit more pagan than the Lord of the Rings is, and I think in some respects, and the Silmarillion more so, and the Children of Húrin is the most pagan of all. just to go off that. But I mean, all those elements are in the books, but they're emphasized or thought about or considered in different ways.
Right. Yeah, and I think in some ways the sort of the unity of Tolkien is almost a red herring. It seems to be it's obviously important, but like you said, it's I like that word, like franchising, where the sort of like the unity of the world between all of his works is sort of overemphasized, and you wouldn't do that with anyone else's works,
No.
If they happen to be set in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, authors. Yeah.
Actually, sorry, just a real quick side question. Yeah. Is there something about the Children of Húrin where Tolkien originally meant this to be actually set outside of Middle Earth or something? Or sorry, outside of like the whole sort of.
It was always in the story cycle, but as I said, like its Genesis really was in the Finnish myth, and then I think the characteristics of the the Norse ethic come to really influence Turin himself as a character. So it's always as a matter of does it really fit in with the rest of the Middle Earth cycle? I think if you're a sort of purist about it and you wanted Tolkien again as this sort of writer of Catholic consolation fairy tales, then no, it doesn't. But that's fine. I think it shows that someone is working with a range of emotions and ideas that are not reducible to one theological vision. And I think you can say that about religious writers just as much as secular writers.
Sure.
So, the people who sort of want to sort of assimilate this into the sort of the consolatory vision. I don't know. I think that diminishes this particular story, I think, because it reduces it to kind of a theological footnote in which, we can get into my thoughts on like theodicies and trying to, religious attempts to explain suffering, but
that'll be interesting.
Yeah. But I think this is an interesting kind of literary, not an attempt to explain suffering, but an attempt to actually show its valence in life, as opposed to trying to make sense of it particularly. Because as we've said, like none of the characters really do.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. So,
any final points?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've sort of I've exercised myself there. My opinions. Yeah, again, look, this is a book, I want to come back to again at some point because it is interesting, and perhaps once you've, if you happen to read it again, perhaps in paperback or hardback, or whatever, because because as you said before, it's given that it is so connected. I mean, comparatively to the Silmarillion cycle, it's definitely one that demands, or that is best enjoyed, I think, over a couple of reads. And whatnot. But I think it's a along with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it's now Tolkien's third sort of essentially novel. I mean, it reads less like a novel and more like an Icelandic saga. Again, that's not an accident, but it is for all intents and purposes a prose work, an extended prose work, a novel, if you will, and it's now the third novel essentially that Tolkien that is approachable, that is fairly and reasonably approachable. So I think that's great that it's there, and I don't know, it's really interesting, and to use that theory word, it problematizes some readers of Tolkien. I think that as you say, tend to oversize the unity of his world, or the sort of the Catholicism of his theological sentiment. So that's a topic we can come back to, but I think this has been a good sort of discussion of our general thoughts about it, and it's interesting to talk about with someone who's also read it.
I'll definitely be getting the paperback, so I can actually sort of try to commit some of it to memory, and quote some. I was jealous when you
I'm sorry.
When you pulled out a quote over there. I'm not in a position to do that, but I suppose I could. I suppose I could find a place where we could have some Christopher Lee on this podcast.
Yeah. Well, it gives us an excuse to come back to it.
There you go.
And for you to quote some stuff.
Yeah. To be continued.
To be continued. Yeah. Well, thank you. We'll leave it there, and all the best.
Yeah.
All right. Talk soon.
Talk soon.